Joining us now, Bob Rae, the former Premier of Ontario, now the Member of Parliament for Toronto Centre. How are you doing tonight, Mr. Rae?
Very well, thank you.
Glad to
be with you.
Glad to have you on the program. I want to take you back to a really fun time in your political career.
They're all fun.
Mid to early 1990s, you know what the recession is doing, you know what the unemployment figures are like, you know what the deficit is like. Where did the idea of asking public servants to take some days off without pay come from?
Well, I mean, it was part of a big package of things that we had to think about. It wasn't just a kind of a one-off. I think the real concern was as we were heading into the third year of our government, although the worst year of the recession was 1990, 1991, the recovery in terms of revenues and employment coming back, 92, was not as good as we'd hoped. So we started to really have a hard look at public finances, at where we were going. And I think a sense of the critical sense came when we began getting reports from the Treasury in the fall and winter of 2002 that we were really 2002, 2003, 1992, 1993 that we were really looking at a $17 billion number rather than a $12 billion number, which had kind of been the working assumption for quite a while. And that happens in a recession, but when it does, it has a way of focusing the mind.
Yes, I had a feeling you were going to use that expression. You called it the social contract, the idea being if 1 million publicly paid employees take a few days off unpaid, that'll avoid you having to fire tens of thousands of people in order to save the money. When you invited all the union leaders into your office to have a discussion about this, what was their reaction?
Well, first of all, it was a long discussion. I mean, first of all, we had to have an internal discussion because there was a lot of people in the government who were very concerned about it. We'd had a series of dialogues with the trade union leadership that had gone on for some time about a number of other things we were doing. I mean, we were determined to maintain our investment in housing. We were determined to keep up our investment in infrastructure. We didn't want to get into huge cuts on the poorest of the poor in terms of people who are on welfare. And so about 65% of the provincial budget is made up of salaries. So when you're saying, well, how are we going to have an effective expenditure control program over the next 3 years if we don't deal with the issue of public sector, the size of the public sector, its compensation, and so on. And that started out as a sort of a discussion. It then there was some reaction. There was obviously some negative reaction. A lot of people who were unhappy. Some people who said they could never consider it. But I was persuaded that it was worth trying because I thought the alternatives were, as often are in politics, it's not like choosing between really good things and really bad things. I haven't had too many of those days. I think what you're often doing is choosing between something that's less good and something that's even worse, and that's sometimes the choices you have to make.
Well, you gave the job to Michael Dechter, one of your top civil servants, to open up negotiations with all of the trade union leaders, including the Ontario Medical Association as well. And I guess I wonder, what made you think that there was the possibility of negotiating something rather than just unilaterally bringing down the hammer on this?
Well, because I felt that people would see the nature of the choice. And I think that was always the battle all the way through, was persuading people that the numbers were what they were, that it was not going to make sense for us to simply increase borrowing beyond, in a budget of $50 billion or $55 billion, to have a $17 billion deficit or to continue with really high deficits without any prospect of them going down. Didn't strike me as very smart, and I thought ultimately become unsustainable. Don't forget, we still had real interest rates. I mean, they weren't what they are now. We didn't have negative interest rates as we do now, so the cost of borrowing was high. And I felt that it was, as we were coming into recovery, which we were in '93, and as things were starting to improve in the private sector economy, it was going to be important for us to be able to keep things under control in the public sector. And I didn't want to take it out of infrastructure. I didn't want to take it out of capital because I thought that was wrong, because we'd end up slowing down other things that we needed to do. So that was the choice. And politically, it was obviously a difficult thing to do. But again, I don't think you want to just take that that request and that aspect of what we were doing and say, well, that's the only thing you were doing, because in fact, we were determined to maintain commitments to housing. We were determined to build new subway lines, only one of which ended up being built by Mr. Harris. Others were canceled. And one of them, in fact, the one that was canceled is now being renewed by the McGuinty government with the support of the Fed. So 15 years later, we're going to get the York University subway when we could have had it in 1996 or 1997. So, I do think that we made some choices. Our successors made other choices, and we live with the consequences.
And when you watch TV the night the negotiations broke down, and you saw the head of the Ontario Federation of Labour and the head of the Ontario Medical Association locked arm in arm singing "Solidarity Forever," what went through your mind at that moment?
Well, we were obviously disappointed. I mean, it was a very tense moment because I'm sure Michael and others can tell you, Michael Decter, if he's coming on your program, I mean, it was quite a close run thing. I mean, we did make a lot of progress at a lot of the tables, and we came very, very close. And I'm still, you still wonder, going back in your mind, is there anything we could have done differently? You always think that. Is there something we could have done that would have made that negotiation come to a better conclusion? We came very close, and it didn't quite work. And I don't think people were fully aware of the fact that if it didn't work that way, we'd have to do it another way, which would be more complicated and less desirable. But we were determined to get to where we needed to go. But I think we were asking the unions a lot. I think it's hard for union leaders to actually ask people to take less. I think in the public sector, it was probably the first time that it had been tried to be done through a negotiation. And as I've said on many other occasions, it's very difficult. In the private sector, you can get into bargaining about tougher alternatives because the alternative is very clear. The padlock is on the gate, the banker's at the door, the choices are there. We did that in Kapuskasing. We did it right through Northern Ontario. We did it in Algoma Steel. We had to make very difficult decisions. And the workers ultimately bought in because they could see the plus side. They could see the fact that the alternative was going to be much, much worse. But to do that in the public sector is hard because it's the government. And the assumption is, well, the government's always going to have money and the government's always going to come up with the cash. So I think it's in that context, I think it's hard to get public sector workers to agree to make concessions.
I don't know if you saw Michael Decter's piece in the Toronto Star recently. He did an op-ed offering some advice to the current premier. Well, you must have loved this line. I'm going to quote it here. Here's some advice from Mr. Decter, which says, "Do not, as Bob Rae did privately, refer to the key public sector labor leaders as, quote, the 4 windbags of the apocalypse. This will make your negotiators' task harder." Did you really say that?
I don't remember saying it, but if Michael says I did, but I think he says it in the article that I said it privately, but apparently that wasn't the case.
Well, you did say it privately. Is he right?
I didn't say it in the Toronto Star.
No, you didn't. He did.
Mr. Decter did. I didn't.
Is he right when he says that in the interest of getting a settlement, that may be ill-advised? If Dalton McGuinty's watching?
I mean, if you can't have a sense of humor in this business, then you can't survive. I think I'm well known as somebody who, in both private, dare I say it, in public conversation, say what I think. But I think it is a tough discussion, and I think it's a matter of trying to persuade people what the alternatives are, and that's not always easy.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's ask the bottom line question here. You brought in the social contract in order to save. Remember, it was part of that 3-legged stool, of course: program cuts and tax increases, and then the social contract. The idea being to save $6 billion at the end of the day. Did the social contract, in fact, save $2 billion, which was the plan?
Just about, yeah. I think as Floyd used to say, spot on, just about spot on. We did actually affect a lot of savings in public sector compensation over that period, and we did save a lot of jobs. I mean, when Mr. Harris came in, he took a very different approach, saying there would be no social contract. The unions all cheered. And then, of course, we all know what happened. There were literally thousands of nurses that were fired. Thousands of teachers lost their jobs. We had basically a pitched battle in our public education system for the better part of 6 or 7 years. And very bad relations with the municipalities, very tough sets of issues there. And ultimately, I think a playing field where Mr. McGuinty was able to come in as a man of peace and reconstruction.
Well, before that, though, Mike Harris,
with a relatively stronger economy and a lot of wind in the sails of the provincial revenues, and I think that had been the situation that Mr. McGuinty took forward for the better part of 6 or 7 years after that.
not to quibble with you, but Mike Harris won a second consecutive majority before any of that happened, and you, obviously you got asked the question whether politically he made the smarter decision by firing all those people. He was seen as a tough guy, prepared to make tough decisions, whereas you went for what you thought was a more humane approach and didn't get rewarded for it.
Well, we don't always get our rewards on this earth. That happens. I'm quite happy with where I am, and I'm sure Mr. Harris is very happy where he is. But seriously, I think we made the right choice. I think for us, it was a hard one, and particularly for a Social Democratic Party. It's very difficult in dealing with the unions in that context, and we're not the first Social Democratic Party to experience that. The Labour Party in England went through huge changes and adjustments and difficult moments because the labor unions decided that they weren't going to support Mr. Callaghan in the end of the 1970s because he was making similar demands and requests, and they decided to go with Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher also won successive mandates, which I suppose from the point of view of the Conservatives is great. But when I look at how long it's taken Britain to reconstruct its public services, to reconstruct the National Health Service, to do some of the difficult things which they've had to do, I still don't believe that there are any circumstances in which the neo-conservative solution is the sensible solution. And I don't take away from that.
Okay, Dalton McGuinty, as you know, floated a bit of a trial balloon out there. They called them, instead of Rae Days, Dalton Days. And even though he never confirmed that he was going to do it, he mused about it. And then he took it back. Was it a mistake to take it back?
Well, it's up to him. I mean, the one thing you learn is that these are decisions that are made on the basis of the circumstances. The circumstances now are a little different. Politically, they're a little different. But I do think that from the point of view of public finances, we face some tough choices in Ontario and in Canada as time goes on. We all hope that the economy recovers and that revenues rebound quickly and that governments won't have to make difficult decisions. But if you look, frankly, throughout North America, if you look at what Governor Schwarzenegger's gone through, in which states throughout the United States are going through right now, where furlough leaves and unpaid leaves and all sorts of decisions like that have had to be made. They're very difficult, but they're hardly, as I said, they weren't unique to me as time went on. In fact, by the time I was Premier, Premier Filmon had Filmon Fridays. Many other provinces had similar circumstances and similar days and similar efforts. And I think our municipalities are going to have to make some choices and offer unions choices in terms of how to proceed. And even President Obama in his inaugural speech talked about how worthy it was for some people to give up a day's pay so somebody else could keep on working. We now have, through the unemployment insurance plan, this thing called shared work time, and work sharing is now very common in the private sector. In fact, it's subsidized by the employment insurance system. So I think what started out looking as if it was sort of some move of kind of desperation, which it really wasn't. We did have choices. We made this one. It was a bold choice at the time, and like a lot of bold choices, the first time you do it doesn't always work perfectly the way you want it to. But I do think it was the right decision to make, and I do think we had to make some choices. And I look at Princess Margaret Hospital, which went up, was finished, completed, built. I look at a lot of the infrastructure we were able to do. I look at the many public projects that we did throughout the province. I think of the reconstruction that we were able to do with the 407 highway, which was a big project for us. We weren't able to get the subways done because Mr. Harris canceled them, and I think that was a very unwise decision. And I still think that today. We didn't cut welfare by 22%. Frankly, I'm proud of that, and I don't take anything away from that. So you live with what you do. I have no regrets. I would have liked to have had another term as Premier, but a lot of things have happened since then. So I think you just keep going.
Indeed. I've got a couple of minutes left and want to do two more quick things if I can. I want to put a chart up now, which you will not be able to see, but which I will describe to you, showing the Ontario.
Puts me at a slight disadvantage. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to describe it. Here's the Ontario unemployment rate through the year 2009, and essentially the public employees of this province have seen their unemployment between a band of, say, 2 and 4%, whereas in the private sector, it's been between 8 and 10% across the year. A little spike in the public employees around the end of August, but otherwise, much lower numbers. And, you know, again, I wonder if Dalton McGuinty's right when he says the recession really hasn't hit those who work in the public sector, and therefore they need to think about how they're going to contribute, you know, to the easing of the obligations on the Ontario public purse. Is he right to say that?
Well, I think he's right to say it. That I think, having said it, it's not that easy to do. Because the simple fact is, somebody who's working in the public sector will say, look, well, I'm a teacher, I'm a nurse, I'm doing my job, I'm providing a valuable public service. The province needs what I do, the public needs what I do, the public doesn't pay me a tremendous amount of money. I get paid a reasonable wage, I have reasonably good pension and job security, but I'm providing a valuable service here. Why should I have to give up what I've negotiated, what my union has negotiated for me? And that attitude is very understandable. I don't blame anybody for having that attitude. I don't even think it's a selfish attitude. I think it's just a very human attitude. The trouble is that there's really no public sector equivalent to what happens in the private sector except for debt. And I think the lesson we learned in the 1990s, and we all learned it, NDP, Liberal, Conservative, right across the board, and in every province right across the country, the lesson we've learned is that there's nothing wrong with running a deficit as long as it's under control, but there are some limits to debt, that you can't just accumulate debt indefinitely without there being a day of reckoning. And I think that's something that everybody has to think about.
Mr. Rae, as always, it's good of you to join us on TVO. Thanks for this walk down memory lane.
Well, I've been a rising star in 5 decades. I'm sure we'll be talking in the next 10 years.
Indeed we shall. Thanks so much.